Greetings, everyone. So go ahead and take out your notes and your trusty highlighter. We're going to go through some really interesting topics. I'm going to go as quick as possible, dealing with women specifically and their experiences with plantation life. I will try to define and as best I can, and some of this may be a little bit hurtful to hear, but it's the truth. And it's important that you know the family dynamics of the plantation, how men felt, how women felt, and then the triangular families, as we called them, meaning the white plantation owner, his wife, and then the slave. So we'll be talking a little bit about those. It's women and slavery, gender differences, conflicts, and American Southern life. So let's get going. Let me move my face out of the way so you can see the picture. All right, so let's start around the year 1807. And we began to see a little bit of a slowdown in the transatlantic slave trade. And then in 1808, officially, some historians will argue, I will need to tell you this, that it was 1807, but 1808, that the slave trade the transatlantic slave trade, to be more specific, is actually barred in the North. So you get this slowdown of the influx of slaves coming in from the western coast of Africa. So just keep that in mind. Changes in slavery post the U.S. War for Independence. Like I said, the slave population was beginning to increase naturally as gender ratios began to even out. And it increased naturally due to, like I said, the slave trade being halted in 1808. The natural increase the need for slaves and slave owners to kind of shift their lifestyles and the way in which plantations are populated is as a result too, especially in the South, of new inventions. So if you look here at this picture right where I'm circling, you'll see the cotton gin. And basically with the creation of the cotton gin, one would think, oh my goodness, slavery is going to come to a halt or slow down even more, because now that we have the cotton gin, we have a machine. It's basically the cotton engine, and it separates the cotton from the seed. And you can basically roll the roller like you see here on the end, and it picks it, sorts it, does everything it needs to do. However, instead of slavery in the South in particular coming to more of a standstill, it actually increases. So make sure you write that down. As a result of the cotton gin, the slavery in the South increases. Highlight that. Why? When there's more money, you want more operational means to get to it. So you need more money to buy these cotton engines, and you need more slaves to operate them. So since slavery in the transatlantic slave trade had slowed down, slave owners have to depend on the breeding on their own plantations to produce more of a slave population. Another thing that it says on here, I want to make sure I mention the cotton gin also, and the Indian Land Removal Act that takes place in the Deep South, mainly in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, like it says right here, is also taking a little bit away from the slavery population. So we have to focus now on natural procreation on plantations. Make sure you highlight this, King Cotton. It's called King Cotton Diplomacy pretty soon during the Civil War when we talk about that. But it required more land, more labor, and more slaves. And I want you to know that's more particularly in the southern part of the United States. Keep in mind, if you need to pause the video, rewind, go back, that's what this is about. So we're going to talk about women in particular, and there's a lot of this that really inflates or correlates, I should say, and infuses with popular culture and how women of color are actually portrayed in hip hop and videos, and the stereotypes that women of color do endure and have to overcome, believe it or not, is based some in the perpetuation of these myths while they were on the slave plantation. So we're going to talk about two stereotypes, the Jezebel stereotype and the Mammy stereotype. I am very, very, very familiar in particular with the Mammy stereotype because I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and the Mammy stereotype is actually a money-making tool for where I grew up. If you go through the open air markets, you're going to see these cookie jars, you're going to see pictures of pickaninnies and other kind of slave generalizations that a lot of people that come in, especially from the Midwest or the North, view as historical objects to collect and use for auction, whereas people of color, especially professors and intellectuals, really begin to dig into the meaning of these objects. And slowly but surely, we're seeing them disappear in Charleston, but they're definitely still there. So let's talk about the Jezebel picture. And I tried to get ones that were school appropriate. So let's look at this picture I've included. As you can see, we still have the black-faced and minstrel show type of stereotypes. You see the slave has the wild hair, the very, very, very dark skin, the bright white eyes and red lips, almost clown-like, infantile, less educated, unkept. And then you see she kind of, you can't really tell, but she doesn't have any clothes on and she's just using the little fan to cover up and have some type of dignity. So let's talk about the Jezebel stereotype. It's perceived that they wanted this stereotype to be their justification for why they took advantage. And you guys know what I mean when I say take advantage. That is mentally, both physically and sexually, of the women that were on the plantation. They used their the way that their body was made up as a weapon against them. So the Jezebel, naturally promiscuous. For those of you that don't know what promiscuous means, it's kind of describes meaning they naturally were kind of obsessed with sexual activity. Okay. It dates back to the early European travelers to Africa that saw the different ways that women of color were shaped and automatically assumed that they were obsessed with that. Europeans mistook semi-nudity for lewdness. If you go to different countries, even when I traveled this summer and even went on the West Coast, you have a regular pool, you have a resort pool, and then you have what's called a European pool. And often in other countries, and being in the military and traveling, nudeness or less clothing was not necessarily deemed as taboo or super scary. That's more of a American concept. And because the African women tended not to completely cover themselves, they definitely had clothes on and had dignity, but completely, well, all except for some tribes like the Zulu tribe, but they didn't completely cover themselves. They were seen as lewd or promiscuous or not as feminine because it was a part of their culture, because sometimes having all those clothes on interfered with their work. But Europeans associated this again with promiscuity. Big difference between this. They perceived that slave women were not as submissive, so they had to be put into submission, subordinate, or they weren't as prudish and they weren't expected to be so. The fundamental image of the Black Jezebel slave was also one of strength, the ability to tolerate high levels of misery, heavy, distasteful work. They were perceived as stronger because they tended sometimes, not all times, to be built bigger than the English women or the American women, if we're talking about after the U.S. Quest for independence. But they were less of women in terms of their femininity. But they were seen to take care of everything, lift heavy boxes or anything that a male slave can do, a female slave can do, and bear the kids at the same time. So that's kind of the Jezebel image and this stereotype that she faced. Again, I'm giving a quick overall view. I hope you take a class on gender politics and or gender political thought when you get in college. Here's again, I showed two different pictures of what a female slave on a plantation looked like. If you see less coverage, and then of course look at the English or American women in this picture, and you'll see the layers and layers of tulle, especially in the South, mainly in the South. The tulles, the hats, the bonnets, the scarves. They had lots of clothes on. So this is in the two women are already deeply contrasted. Slave women's personal and relational activities, and even their private activities, became public topics of discussion. Work conditions were also very conducive to perpetuate that Jezebel kind of myth. They would encourage the slave women to work without clothes, even if some of them wanted to work with clothes on. White women were colors and layers of clothing, while again, white women were allowed to, the more fabric, the better. Even when you went to purchase a female slave on the auction block, slave buyers were permitted to touch, poke, and feel women, even in their very private states or private when they were in their private areas, an attempt to purchase, and they were doing this in an attempt to gauge fertility. So this was all about business. They were being disrespectful in the name of purchasing a commodity or a business. White women were taught from the time they are raised on the plantation. Again, coming from Charleston, this is all kind of natural to me because I kind of grew up seeing a lot of this, but white women were taught that Black women were promiscuous by nature just because of the way they were built or the way they presented themselves. That had more to do, keep this in mind, with culture than promiscuity. I remember when I first moved to Charleston, we would go downtown and we would see the same time of day at 12 noon. And they literally called them the Black Mammies. And this is in the year, I would say, 1998. And the term was still being used. Oh, the Black Mammies are downtown walking the babies out before their afternoon naps. So a lot of these stereotypes were still around in the 90s, and we're talking about something that happened in the 1800s. So just wanted to make a connection. Now let's look at triangular relationships or three-sided relationships. If you ever get the chance, be sure to watch the movie Queen. It is the sequel to Alex Haley's Roots, and the book is just as big, but it's absolutely amazing to read. It is Halle Berry and Raven-Symoné are in it, and she plays basically the daughter of the plantation owner and a slave. And it kind of chronicles her life, her privileges, and sometimes the very low points that she had to face. So let's talk about these three-sided relationships. So you see this picture I added is the plantation master, of course, and his mistress. So often in the South, mainly, marriages were arranged. Who can I marry to keep the wealth in the family and to keep the family name going? So even white men were not so permitted to pick their own wives per se in the South, as it was arranged for mutual benefit. They believed love would come later and you marry for a benefit. So that was the number one. It was all about King Cotton. So you have these three-sided relationships: the slave owner right here, the white mistress, and of course the Black slave. And a lot of people in the South literally tried to ignore this, but it was very evident when the children came out biracial, and it told the story. The interesting part of this, if you look at it from a gender point of view, both women were helpless in the situation. White mistress was unable to defy the social and legal constraints that kept her bound to her husband. So she would know they would sit down, for instance, after dinner and play cards. And then when he was done, she was expected to go upstairs and she would ask him, "Are you going to join me? Or, are you coming upstairs?" And he would say, "Nope, I have some work to attend to." And women weren't dumb. They knew exactly that he was going to be going to the slave quarters. So it was very difficult, But the sad part about this is often the white women would take this out on the slaves. Number one, they were in marriages that they necessarily didn't want to be in. And then they shared, a husband, quote unquote, with another woman. Some women viewed it as a safe haven, that they didn't have to necessarily fulfill all the duties of a wife because that's what the slave girls were for, quote unquote, especially, like I said, in the southern part of the United States. So let's look at the Mammy. This is a picture actually of Hattie McDaniel. Believe it or not, she is a member of my sorority, founded in 1922, Sigma Gamma Rho. She won the first first African American woman to win the Academy Award. There is a lot of discussion, I would say, surrounding her role in the movie Gone with the Wind. And there are some on one side who say this is definitely an accomplishment especially for African American women during the time, while other intellectuals may argue that this is her playing this role as a sassy, kind of mammy, big woman housewife, just perpetuated the myth of the superwoman, non-feminine Black slave, per se, and really did more to hurt the race than it did to help the race progress. She actually did not get to even attend the Academy Award and come through the Academy Awards like everyone else. She didn't get to sit in the same spot. She had to come in the back door. So it's very interesting, these two sides. So let's talk about the Mammy. Make sure you highlight this. The Mammy was the superwoman. She could do anything and it could be done better than anyone else. And she was an expert in everything domestic. Mammies and even just regular slave women often were what we call wet nurses. And I even saw, when I saw this in Charleston for the first time, I almost flipped out. I was like, are you kidding me? But say if your Black domestic or even your Latina domestic was pregnant and happened to be pregnant alongside the mistress or the slave master's wife on the plantation, she can serve as a wet nurse, which means she could actually nurse the white woman's children. She was the premier house servant. All the others were her subordinates. That's kind of how it was set up. She was completely dedicated to the white family, especially the children, even over her own. She can be seen as better treated than the field workers. She received food, dress. She got to dress in layers because she was in close proximity to white women. And remember, if they were in the house, they were more clothed, not because they were in close proximity to white men, but because they were in close proximity to white women. That's the main reason. Often, if you are a slave that is in the house, or you're a mammy and you're caring for the kids, you are of biracial descent. You were seen as better, more feminine. The odd part is you were a product of the slave master oftentimes. So it was a very interesting dynamic. She was on call for 24 hours. She had less private time than the field workers did, because at least when the sundown came, they were allowed to go to their quarters. She was subject to all the mood swings or all the happenings of the white family. The white mistress held the keys to her complete existence. So it was very, very mentally a way to control a slave inside. The mistress did use this power to wield with these women, and if they were frustrated with them a lot. So often they were beat by the mistress, not just the master, but the mistress in particular. So let's talk about, again, just go a little bit more plantation families based on skin color. So how did they determine whether or not you got to go in the house? And some of you may know this already, so this may be just a little bit of a review, but highlight and star the paper bag test. You will hear this referenced in pop culture a lot. If you are lighter than or the color of a paper bag, you were allowed to come inside. Most often these were people of Creole descent or biracial if you're on the plantation. I remember my great grandmother saying, if you're brown, you can stick around, but if you're black, you have to get back. You have the one drop rule, which means no matter how light skinned you are, if we know you have one drop of black blood, then you are considered completely black. There are no phrases like we use now, like biracial or triracial. It was either you're black or you're white. And sometimes it would be even hard to tell. But now we know you can kind of tell if you look at a person's hair, mainly the roots of their hair. And they kind of use that from even back in the day. So the mistress, believe it or not, white women can really tell by looking at the roots of your hair whether or not you are truly going to be subjected to the one drop rule. White women took out their frustrations. We talked about that. Slave men. Let's talk about the dynamic of plantation families. Imagine being a male slave and not being able to protect your wife. Now, they did encourage slaves to marry because, again, remember we talked about the cotton gin and the economical impact that had on the South. So we definitely needed some, baby and breeding making to occur. But imagine having children, and as a father, you can't protect your children or you can't protect your wife. So this was definitely a dynamic, and many intellectuals cite this in connection to today with broken families in communities of color. It's good. It all goes all the way back to slavery of separating the family. Especially men not being able to protect their wives from the physical abuse of the male slave master. Darker women were seen as less feminine, less gentle. Again, they more kind of were sent to the field to work. If you're a paper bag or lighter complected, then you were allowed to go inside. Some intellectuals speak to the theory of Willie Lynch, which is a story, because some people are now saying in modern research that, in fact, the letter that he wrote was not the same as we interpret it today. So let me break it down a little bit. So there was supposedly a white slave owner from Barbados. So highlight him. He's right here, Willie Lynch. And a lot of people in the South were having a problem controlling their slaves. They were running away. They were rebelling, poisoning food, things of that nature. So he came up with a theory of using the skin color of the slaves as a means to control them on the plantation and as a means to kind of divide and conquer. So you had the light-skinned slaves who were in the house who deemed that they were better. And then you had the darker slaves who were outside. And so by putting them together, often it would put slave rebellions down because the lighter-skinned people that were in the house wanted to keep that position. So if they heard about any slave rebellions or anything crazy, all right, going on the plantation, they often ratted them out to the master to keep that position. So it was called kind of the Willie Lynch complex, where he supposedly went and did a speech and really showed the masters in the South how to set this up on the plantation. Some say it actually did not happen that way, and it was just excerpts of something that he wrote. But that's neither here nor there. The concept of divide and conquer on the plantation was heavily used and even is heavily entrenched in the African American culture today of the lighter skin, the better, the darker skin, the not so much better. And these arguments in the community, again, date back from roots in slavery. I think lots of strides are being made in these different areas, but it's still something that is a topic of conversation. And I managed to finish that pretty quickly. So you're going to take a quiz on this next. Make sure you highlight and rewind if you need anything, or contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.